topics. Of course, I've been interested in fish welfare ever since I was a little kid, and that's one of the reasons why I work so closely with fishers and trying to understand how they view the world. And I think probably my only superpower is stepping into their minds and trying to see the world from their perspective. So one of the things that I spent a lot of time on, of course, is trying to understand the cognition of fishes. And from that, I obviously became increasingly associated with understanding their capacity for sentience and ultimately the implications for welfare. I also spent quite some time at the University of Edinburgh working with Victoria Braithwaite and Lynn Snedden. Lynn and I were both postdocs under Victoria's tutelage for quite some time. So I have at least a pretty good background when it comes to these sorts of questions. And I think perhaps one of the things that we often ask is, why should we even care about fish welfare? And obviously in this particular context, at least you guys understand where I'm coming from. But I mean, commercial fisheries are still huge, multi-billion-dollar industries, and a huge number of people around the world rely on fishes as their primary source of protein. It's particularly the case in Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, we've overfished most of the fish stocks around the world, and aquaculture has stepped up and actually since 2024 has replaced fish protein production, replaced wild capture. So for the first time in human history, we now eat more fish that are reared in aquaculture than we actually capture from commercial wild fisheries. Alongside that, the recreational fishing industry is huge in New South Wales alone. It's worth over about $1 billion or something like that, and much of that money ends up in regional areas, and that's why the government is so keen to push recreational fishing. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's up to debate. And perhaps people don't really think about fish as companion animals as often as they should, but in fact, fish are the most common, the most populous companion animal, not just in Australia, but in the world, far more so than cats and dogs. And that's usually because when people keep fish, they have 10 or 20 fish or something in their aquarium. And in fact, if you think about anybody who keeps a pet, in terms of the number of people who have pets, it's second or third after cats and dogs. So there's a huge number of companion animal fishes that are sold through the aquarium trade every year. And as we've just heard in Rachel's introduction, fishes are rapidly replacing rats and mice in scientific research, particularly human research. Increasingly, they use them to understand the influence of drugs and various things on vertebrates, physiology and those sorts of things. People work on them for sleep deprivation studies and all sorts of things. Just about any kind of experiment that has traditionally been, well, originally it would have been done on monkeys, but then on rats and mice is now being done largely on zebrafishes. And of course, if you're interested in conservation biology and biodiversity, there are more species of fish than all the other vertebrates combined. So if you think of all of the lizards and snakes, reptiles in general, all of the amphibians and all of the mammals, and you combine them, there are more fish than all of those. And every year, 200 or 300 more species are discovered, and we reckon there's probably about another 30% that remain unknown. So there's lots of context in which humans interact with fishes. I've just mentioned some of them here, but all of them ultimately have their own welfare considerations. And one thing that really strikes me, having spent many, many years now working on fish intelligence, is this massive gap between the public perception of fish intelligence and the scientific reality. There's still a huge number or proportion of society that seem to think that fish are these sort of mindless automatons. Everybody would have heard the goldfish 2-second memory rule, which is really just a tale. So there's a massive gap. And the problem with that is that ultimately it's public perception that drives animal welfare legislation. And there's no doubt that intelligence, sentience, and welfare are all linked. And by trying to get the message out that fishes are intelligent and sentient animals, I'm hoping that we can drive the wheel to convince people to actually care about them in the same way that we care about other animals. So that's kind of my motivation, and more or less, as it happens, that's my sort of progression as I went through many years of research, very concentrated on fish intelligence, increasingly interested in sentience, and now I'm writing a lot about fish welfare. So one of the problems, as I mentioned, is that we don't think, or generally the public doesn't think that fish are smart, but in fact, fish have been the centre of comparative psychology research since the 50s and 60s, and even before that, if you look back in the German and Russian literature in particular, it was huge in Europe. And despite the fact that we've had many, many decades of research, and in fact, I've literally written books about it and multiple reviews that have got a lot of interest from the media, we still struggle to push this idea across to the general public that fish are in fact intelligent animals. Well, one of the things that I like to do is draw a list of some of the things that, you know, people would generally associate with intelligence in fishes. This is just my top sort of favorite list, I suppose. And the reason I put this list forward is because many of these characters we often associate with humans and the success of humans. But in fact, fishes can not only do all these things, but in many instances, we've used fish as model organisms to understand how the system works, particularly social learning and culture. There is a huge amount of information on social learning and culture in fishes. And we just released a paper yesterday reviewing tool use in fishes. It's got a lot of press. You'll find that in the media right now. I guess, you may as well cut to the chase at the end of the day. One of the most controversial questions probably over the last, it's even longer than 60 years, perhaps getting on to 70 years now, is this question of whether fish feel pain. And quite frankly, the simple answer is yes. And in fact, the reason you and I feel pain is we inherited most of the mechanisms, the sensory capacities, the emotional capacities, and even partially our brain structure from our fishy ancestors. And one of the components of that is the discovery that fish have nociceptors. Now, nociceptors are the actual nerve endings in our skin and the skin of many animals that detect noxious stimuli in the first place. It's the beginning of, the beginning of the pain pathway, effectively. But what many people don't realise is that, not only did Lynn and Victoria discover nociceptors in the early 2000s using a rainbow trout model, in fact, nociceptors date back to the annelids. So we're talking about 600 million years worth of evolution. So annelids, for people who aren't aware, these are little sandworms that, if you go fishing, you often extract them from the sand using special pumps. So just about every animal that's ever been examined has nociceptors. And really the question now is not whether or not fish actually have nociceptors, but in fact what goes on from a cognitive and an emotional setting. And that is actually the human definition of pain. It's a sensory and emotional experiences associated with potential or actual tissue damage. And you can imagine the capacity to feel pain and avoid tissue damage is a really, really fundamental aspect of animal physiology. And it's no wonder that it goes back so far in time. So the way I like to think about pain, and it's certainly from an evolutionary perspective, is thinking about what sorts of functions pain actually provides to animals who have it. And there are really two components to it. The first is reflexive, and these are the nociceptive reflexive behaviors that even humans possess. So many of you, if you've touched a hot plate or something hot and your hand, it pulls back, that's a reflex. So that's your nociceptors reporting to your nervous system. And in fact, that only gets as far as your spine. And your spine is semi-autonomous, and it is able to send a motor nerve response back to your arm, and that withdrawal reflex is your nociceptors working. Sometime later, that message makes it to your brain. And it's at this point where you start to think, oh, that was a nasty experience. And for me, that emotional pain that you feel is a really, really strong reinforcer to remind you not to do that again. So many of you will have felt that, and often if you look at the literature in animals and in children and even in adults, you're much more likely to learn things if there's a negative outcome than if there's a positive outcome, and you tend to remember them for a much longer time. So I think what's really key here is if you didn't have that long-term capacity, that emotional response to pain, basically reinforcing the idea that you should not do that behavior again, then you would literally, just having been burnt, you would turn around and walk straight back into the fire. And I can tell you from an evolutionary perspective, that is a dead end. Like a species will not go very far if they cannot remember and respond appropriately to these sorts of negative experiences. And this is one of the reasons why we spend a lot of time focusing on sentience and intelligence. And it's because sentient and intelligent animals have a much greater capacity to suffer, because they are capable of not only looking back in the past and remembering these negative experiences, they can also project forward and anticipate negative things happening to them again in the future, should they find themselves in that same context or situation. Now, for quite some time, at least when I went through university, one could not even mention the fact that animals might even have emotions. But we're kind of over that now. Back in the day, we used to think that it was, a bit egocentric to project ourselves and our feelings onto animals. But we're certainly well over that, because science has come a long, long way in the last 20 or so years. And what's interesting is if you go back to Charles Darwin, he wrote an entire book called The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. And like many things with Charles Darwin, he was way ahead of his time. And Charles basically had this idea that not only do animals have emotions, but social animals in particular need to display emotions externally as a way of communicating their inner feelings. Because as we all know, unless you're a mind reader, you don't really know what's going on inside other people's minds. And of course, that's true of people. It's also true of trying to understand what's going on inside animals' minds. And obviously, the less experienced you are with a given species, the less likely you are to understand what's likely going on inside that animal's mind. Fortunately, I spent 30 or more years, plus my entire childhood, playing with fishes, and I have a pretty good understanding of what they're capable of and how they view the world. But what is interesting is that Darwin basically had this concept that emotions not only are one of the major drivers of animal behavior, and they are also adaptive in both the respect that it drives behavior and decision-making process, as well as providing a way to outwardly express an animal's inner feelings. So that was 150 years ago. Now, at the most fundamental level, I think we've now, certainly over the last 10 years, we've come to, I guess, full circle, effectively, back to where Charles Darwin left off. And increasingly, people recognise that emotions are, in fact, the guide, one of the key guides, may even be a common currency that drives animal behaviours. You have to remember that many animals have conflicting motivations and needs across various different parts of their body system. And one way to overcome some of these conflicts is to have a common currency. And it may well be that emotions may be that currency. So they not only reward positive behavior and reinforce positive behavior, but emotions also discourage us from behavior that has resulted in poor outcomes or punishment. And we've known that fishes have parts of their nervous system, much the same as our nervous system, such as the functional equivalents to the limbic and dopaminergic nervous systems, which are associated with reinforcing behavior. We've known not only that they have that, but we know exactly where in the fish brain these sorts of things occur. And you can see I've listed a review paper from a Spanish research group here from 2006. And here in that paper, they found that the medial pallium is responsible for emotional memory in fishes. 2006, that's nearly 20 years ago. So we not only knew that they had emotions, but we knew where in the brain that process was happening. So long gone are the days where one could not even talk about emotions in animals. We now recognize that they're drivers, important drivers of animal behavior, and are probably universal across all vertebrates. And certainly increasingly, the further we look into the invertebrates, the more we find similar sorts of systems, related systems that are driving animal behavior and decision-making in invertebrates too. So one of the things, of course, we like to do as scientists is tabulate lists of evidence. And this is just some of the evidence that's often put forward. I've shortened and condensed some of these criteria to some extent and even combined some of them to reduce the complexity of this. But there are multiple versions of this. This one is adapted from Walters in 2018, and I've published various versions of this myself. And what you can see here is a list of various criteria which we use to identify whether or not an animal is likely capable of feeling in pain. What are the criteria? What are the indicators that you might need? And it starts off with a whole bunch of sort of neurophysiology type thing, but you can see that it quickly changes to a series of different sorts of behaviors, changes in behavior in response to pain, protective behaviors, the fact that drugs, particularly analgesics, reduce responses, that animals might self-administer drugs whenever they're in pain, that pain takes priority over other behaviors and these sorts of things. But the last three in particular, which I put asterisks next to, these are situations where the animal is clearly having to make decisions about whether how it trades off pain with other sorts of things that it needs. And this is the kind of thing that we are often using as our best evidence that many of the pain-related behaviors that we see in animals are not nociceptive reflexes, as you commonly hear from the very few remaining scientists that believe that these animals are not capable of feeling pain. They are clearly long-term, deeply cognitive decisions that these animals are making behavioural preferences or choices, paying a cost in order to avoid pain, and trade-offs with other requirements. So, apart from the fact that there's a lot of experimental evidence behind this, one of the clear things that you can see from this is, unsurprisingly, we know a lot about pain in mammals, which is hardly surprising. People have been studying pain in humans and other mammals for a very long time. But what may be surprising to many people is that the next best studied group of animals is fish. And currently there are over 2,000 papers that are devoted to understanding or discussing pain in fishes. Easily the next most biggest research area. And notice that our evidence for fishes is just as comprehensive as it is for mammals. Unsurprisingly, after that, we have birds. But what may surprise people is, rather than cephalopods, which is octopus, squid, and cuttlefish being the next cab off the rank, it's in fact decapod crustaceans. And I might point out that the gaps in this doesn't mean that there's a lack of, that there's evidence that these animals don't have these capacities. It's actually a lack of research. And the reason decapod crustaceans are next is simply because there's a couple of really devoted labs, primarily in Europe and particularly in Ireland, that have been working on hermit crabs and various other decapod crustaceans and their capacity for feeling and responding to pain for many years. So we have really good evidence for them. So if you see movements like, preserving the rights and welfare of crustaceans, crustacean compassion, for example, in the UK, the reason that is getting off the ground so strongly is because there's so much good research coming out of those few labs. So many of the animal welfare legislations around the world are including decapod crustaceans and increasingly cephalopods. The information for reptiles and amphibians is much less, and that's simply because it's very hard to work with these groups, and very few people in the world are doing that work. So that remains a big gap in our knowledge. What is interesting over the last particularly 5 or 6 years is there's a massive push, I would say now, the sort of frontier of pain and sentience in animals is within the insects. So it's going to be interesting watching that space in the next few years. So what I thought I might do is just provide you with some of the sort of case studies, the evidence, as it were, to give you a feeling for how this sort of research is typically done and what the evidence looks like. The first one is from Lynn. In fact, a lot of the work comes from Lynn. She's been working on this for quite many years now. This is one of the very early experiments where she was looking for evidence that pain in trout might affect their behaviour in various ways. And of course, one of the easiest things to measure is feeding behaviour in these animals. On the whole, most animals are very driven to feed as often as they can. And in this case, she was looking at the time to resume feeding. You can see that on this axis here, the time taken to start feeding. And there are a number of different contexts here. The first is a control. The controls are simply taken out of their aquarium, briefly handled, and then put back in. Then we have a saline injection, where the animal is taken out, handled, and injected in the lip with a small amount of saline. Doesn't hurt them other than the small prick of the injection. Of course, they don't like being handled. And then we have bee venom. And the reason she used bee venom is because the vast majority of people on the planet have some idea of what it feels like to be stung by a bee. It's a little bit painful, but you get over it pretty quickly. And then she has a mild acetic acid injection, which is specifically designed to mimic the sorts of pain you would get from bee venom. And it's quite obvious that control and saline animals return to feeding at about 80 minutes after they've been handled. It takes them quite a while to get over the whole handling procedure, but it's clearly more than twice that when they've been injected with venom or acid. They just go off their food, as many animals do when they're feeling pain. Incidentally, follow-up experiments showed that if you provide a local anaesthetic at the same location as that injection of venom or acid, it returns to normal straight away. There's no response. Another couple of different methods of measuring changes in behaviour. This is a much later paper, but it's much the same idea. Here you can see a change in activity. This is a reduction in activity from baseline. So typically when animals are suffering from pain, they stop moving around. You imagine you've got a sore ankle or you've got a headache or whatever. What do? You go and lie down. You put your feet up or whatever it is you do. So your activity patterns generally go down. So this is a change, a decline in behaviour. And it's the same kind of thing. Again, here we have a saline injection, an acid injection, and here's a bunch of potential analgesics, the last one being a local anaesthetic of lidocaine. And what you can see here is that generally, if you handle them and give them a saline injection, yeah, okay, well, it takes them a little while. Their activity goes down a little bit relative to baseline. But what is interesting, that is, if you give them an acid, of course, their activity goes down a lot. But then if you give them lidocaine, a local injection, their behaviour returns to normal. Another way of measuring the behavioural response here is a percular beat rate. That's how quickly are they breathing. Unsurprisingly, when they're suffering from pain, any animal, including us, their breathing rate tends to go up. And here you can see an increase, slight increase in response to handling and a saline injection, a really big increase, more than double, almost threefold increase in response to an acid injection. And once again, if you give them a local anesthetic, it dramatically reduces that change in opercular beat rate. So we have returning to feeding, reduction in activity, and a changes in breathing, all in response to a bee venom simulation. One of the more sophisticated questions is how they trade off, and these are these sort of asterisk things I was pointing to in the table before, how they trade off pain with the other sorts of things they need. And this is the kind of setup that most people use. And I've referenced a couple of different studies here. Notice how long ago these were done, 20 years ago, more or less. And there are kind of two contexts. The first, you can ask the fish to trade off pain for access to their friends. Fish are very social. They like to hang out with their mates. Or you can ask them to trade off pain with food. Either of those situations are asking the fish to make difficult decisions, because obviously they like being with their friends and they like eating. And obviously the hungrier they are, the more inclined or the more motivated they are to eat. So you can put them in these trade-off positions and ask themselves what they will do. And this is the kind of typical setup. In this particular case, they're enforcing an electric shock in the area closest to their mates over here. So there's a chance, if they go into this area early on, that they will receive a shock. And of course, you can do that with and without their friend on the other side. And although this looks like a bit of a horrendogram, it's reasonably easy to follow. In the first instance, you have the end of the aquarium far away from the jolt, in the middle of the aquarium, and the area where the jolt is, remembering that the conflict actually happens in that area where the jolt is, because you can have food or friends there. And the black line is what happens if you have no fish on the other side of that partition. So there's no friend. And unsurprisingly, you can see that before the shock, they're evenly distributed across the aquarium. You can see here before, and before, about 30% of the time, give or take. During the simulation, unsurprisingly, they get as far away from that shock as possible, which is why these error bars go shooting up. And after that shock, well, they spend even more time as far away from that error as they possibly can. In contrast, when they have a friend on the other side of that aquarium, clear partition, they like to spend time close to their mates before. Even if you shock them, they still like to spend time. And in fact, they increase the time close to their mates after the shock. And the reason for that, of course, is that one of the ways that fishes respond to a fright is to school, and they school tightly. So in fact, their compulsion to spend more time with their mates goes up the more frightened they are. And here you can see that they really highly value access to their schoolmates when they've been frightened, or in this case, they've received an electric shock. So a really clear case where they're trading off very strongly favouring social contact during pain and after frightening experiences. One of the other experiments, I should say that the experiment where you do this with food, initially they will not go near that jolt, but the longer you starve the fish, the more likely they will approach that shock area in order to access food. And that's because their motivation to feed ultimately overcomes their fear of the shock. They have to eat. That becomes the most important driver. And that comes back to that current common currency that I was talking about earlier. One of my favorite experiments was also done by Lynn some time ago, more than 10 years ago now. And in this experiment, she basically asked the fish a simple question: do you like to spend time in a complex, enriched in habitat or not? And hardly surprising, if you ask them that question, they invariably spend as much time as they possibly can in these more complicated environments. This is a bulk standard result for most animals, including fishes. But what is interesting, if you give them a painful stimulus, in this case, the injection of acid, and you provide analgesics in the plain area, they shift their behavior. So they actually prefer access to pain relief over complex environments, again, making quite a complex trade-off in terms of their behaviour and their requirements. So this is just a quick conclusion. Fish are intelligent creatures. The evolutionary function of pain is ancient and highly conserved. No doubt it goes back well beyond the vertebrates, possibly quite far into the invertebrates as well. Fish have neurons associated with nociceptors. They have particular parts of the brain that are responsible to the emotional response to pain. They engage cognitively with pain perception. It's not just some nociceptive reflex that the critics often say. Evidence for pain in fish is just as good as it is for mammals. And there are obviously big implications because, you know, billions of fish are inhumanely killed every year. You only have to think about commercial fisheries, less so nowadays in aquaculture, but nonetheless, we've got a long way to go. And we obviously need to review animal welfare legislation and our interactions with fishers more broadly with this sort of information. And I think I'll leave it there. Hopefully you guys have got some questions. If I can get control of my cursor, and I'll bring me back to here.